Jesus talked about the wheat and the tares growing at the same time.
Right.
Again, in context, it was talking about leading up to the end of the age, and therefore the end of the old covenant age. And therefore, in that time, there were those who were following Jesus, and there were those who were not following Jesus. And therefore, you would say the wheat and the tares were a reflection of that. It also relates to the fact that it talks about that God has sown sons into the world, and the enemy is also sown into the world. So there, you could also look at it from a slightly different perspective in regards to the sons of God and those who are operating in the enemy's kingdom. But bottom line is, what happens to them. And if you look at what Jesus said, that the wheat and the tares get taken first. So that was, you could say, at the end of the age, all those who were not following Jesus were taken first. They all lost their possession of the land. They were all dispersed or killed. So from that perspective, there's a natural perspective of what happened. And Jesus warned of what those who didn't follow him would end up being destroyed alongside Jerusalem. So you can see it as a covenantal issue rather than looking at it today as believers and non-believers. Because today we don't have believers and non-believers. Actually, we have believers and not yet believers, or believers and not those who have not yet realized. Because God has already done the work in all of them. They're already reconciled. They've already been forgiven. They've already been born from above. They just don't know it yet. So from that perspective, it's a very different thing in the new covenant than it was in the old. So Jesus was talking to them in light of the end of the old covenant. And of course, if you didn't understand some of the symbolism of the Old Testament, it was very difficult for people today to get the context fully of what he was talking about. But when Jesus was talking primarily in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he was addressing those who were still under the old covenant, still living under the law, who had not yet followed Jesus and come out of that religious self-righteousness. John's gospel was talking to those who already had a relationship with Jesus. Therefore, Jesus revealed himself in many different ways: the way, the truth, and the life, the resurrection and the life, the door, the shepherd of the sheep. So there was a different context to the three synoptic gospels, who were primarily talking to Israel, who were still under the old covenant. And therefore, most of what Jesus said to them does not apply to us today. It applied to that age and to those people. And Jesus was trying to get them to leave religion behind and follow him. And he warned them what would happen. There are some here who won't yet see death until you see the Son of Man coming in his glory. So the Son of Man came in his glory. Did he find faith on the earth? Well, yes, he did find faith. Those who left Jerusalem in following his instruction to warn them when the armies were coming to run to the hills, they all ran to the hills, were saved. Those who didn't believe in what he said died or were dispersed. So all of that context is not talking about today. In fact, most of what Jesus was talking about in those three gospels wasn't talking about today at all, although there is some context to it. John's gospel definitely is talking about those who were going to come into the relationship where they know Jesus was in them and they were in Jesus. John 14, all of that, love one another as I've loved you, all of that dimension was a totally new covenant dimension, which is why John wrote about it, because John had a revelation of Jesus from heart to heart communication, not just by teaching. So that's why John presented a very different gospel about us being one. The fact the world will see your disciples by your love for one another. Very, very different, because he was addressing the disciples rather than addressing those who were not followers of him yet. Now, of course, after the resurrection and after he went into the ascension, there were occasions where thousands followed him, from that place, but there were still those who didn't, and there were times when some of the priests followed him when they saw some of what he had done. But primarily, we need to look at the tares as being a covenantal picture of those who were not following God and entering into following Jesus, and were essentially sown into the world. Now, also, when you look at the Old Covenant people, the Pharisees and Sadducees and those who were religious leaders, Jesus had a lot of woes to them. In Matthew 21 to 23, there was woe to you. Now those were the blind who were leading the blind, who were the tares. Now, just because they were leaders in Israel didn't mean they weren't tares, because they weren't believers. Paul said not all Israel was truly Israel, only those of the faith of Abraham. And most of those Sadducees and Pharisees were basically following Talmudic Judaism, mixture of the stuff that came out of Babylon. Hence the whole rabbinical system came out of Babylon. There was no rabbis before they went into exile. So we have a different concept, and Jesus was addressing that when he was talking about the wheat and the tares. And of course, the enemy wanted to sow into a mixture so that the people wouldn't know who to follow. That's why Jesus said, you're like sheep without a shepherd. You don't know who to follow, because those people that you think you're following are actually not even followers of God in relatively. So really that's how I would see wheat tares.